Morning. First thing to say is I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be with you. I am actually in London at the moment because after agreeing to lead these sessions with Ruth, which I'm delighted to be doing, I was invited to be part of a small group of Methodists who are meeting MPs in Parliament today to talk about being a justice-seeking church. So that's where I am. I'm grateful that you've turned up, though, and I have to confess a little bit of trepidation. I'm aware that Reverend Dr. Roger Walton led last year's sessions, and I have to confess that I am certainly no great biblical scholar like he is. I guess my passion would be in the sharing of stories, because I think we gain an awful lot from the stories that we share. So as we meet through these sessions, I hope there'll be opportunity to hear, to listen, to share stories, to reflect on stories together. In 2021, I was invited to be part of the reference group for the Walking with Micah project. This was a project that was commissioned by the Methodist Conference and was led by Rachel Lampard. The idea was essentially for a 2-year process of listening to the Methodist Church, to Methodist organisations and societies, to listening all around the issue of justice and injustice. So, in what ways are we as a church responding to the injustices that we see around us? In what ways are we speaking out for justice on behalf of others? And more than that, what are our priorities for justice? Justice is such a broad issue. Injustice, there are so many. So what are the things that the Methodist people think are priorities around injustice and justice? And of course, what is our DNA? What is our history, our tradition, our hymnody? What are the things that make us Methodist in terms of our justice story? So at this year's Methodist Conference, a report was brought. The Walking with Micah report was presented and was accepted by the Methodist Conference. And this has gone forward into what is now termed our justice-seeking strategy. There are a number of resources and papers on the Methodist website if you would like to go and look and read. So today, I really want to begin by looking at that theme of a justice-seeking church and exploring a little bit of that material. There'll be time to talk as well, and maybe at the end to have a little bit of Bible study. Next week, we'll get far more into the Bible study because we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 9. We're going to look at the names of the Messiah, and especially through the lens of a justice-seeking church. Week 3, we're going to go to the prophetic voice, not just Isaiah, but also John the Baptist, other prophets, and to look at those 5 priorities that the Methodist Church has made for justice seeking. And then in session 4, we will come closer to Christmas as we look at the Magnificat at the Annunciation, at some of the nativity stories, but also beyond that to Anna and Simeon, to the flight to Egypt, to the voices from the margins. So, beginning today, what does it mean to be a justice-seeking church? I think all of us have a sense of justice. Probably more acutely, we have a sense of injustice. We notice when justice is absent. This is far more than just mere fairness. This is about important issues where people are left behind, issues where people are excluded, issues where creation is not valued. But what does it mean to seek justice as a people of faith? What does God's justice look like? Because essentially, if we are a justice-seeking church, then we must and always be rooted in God's justice. I'm hoping that I can share my screen and this will work on the recording. Hang on, here we go. Oh, yes, good. I think that's working. Let's just do that. There we go. So, biblical justice. There are two words essentially in the Hebrew that refer to justice, that are translated as justice. The first is tzedakah, which is often translated as righteousness, and sometimes even as charity. It's not necessarily just about generosity, but actually about what it means to be part of a community of God's people. So an example of tzedakah might be Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. This is about what it means to act in justice, justly. It is about what we do when we recognize injustice. In Luke 12, Jesus would have used that word tzedakah. Sell your possessions and do tzedakah. Give to the poor. Offer charity. Care for those most in need. The second word is mishpat, which in some places is referred to as equity, but an equity that is laid down in judgment, an equity that is about God's judgment for others. It is about a just society. So as Leviticus 24 says, you have one mishpat, law, for the alien and one for the native born. Sorry, it's one and the same. For I am the Lord your God. So there is no separation between the laws that are for those who belong and those who have come from outside. Mishpat, equity of judgment. The words are often interchangeable, though. We can see this in Proverbs 2. Do what is right, tzedakah, and just, mishpat, is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. So in the Old Testament, God's justice is seen in the laws protecting strangers, in the prophets who call out injustice, in complex stories of liberation, of healing, of reconciliation. Jesus' death and resurrection also showed that the alienation and injustices of the world do not have the last word. Rather, everyone is invited to participate in God's new kingdom of liberation, justice, and joy. Of course, God's perfect justice is beyond our human endeavour. We seek to align ourselves. We seek as a church to be committed to justice seeking, but it will only ever be an approximate to divine justice. And our human actions for justice will always be imperfect and insufficient. The Methodist Church has a rich history in justice seeking. Our heritage, our calling, are very much all about seeking justice. Wesley encouraged Methodist societies to not only give to those in need, but to befriend those experiencing poverty, to understand their story, to challenge the attitudes and economic structures that kept people in poverty. Our Methodist heritage, our primitive heritage, has that very much in the fore. We know as the primitives, the leadership wasn't just from the hierarchy. Leadership was encouraged from the margins. People were equipped to resist injustice. This came through education, through the nurturing of self-worth, through strong belief systems, through righteous anger. We know the stories of 19th century agricultural labourers, for example, who learned to speak out and lead in the church, and therefore were able to assert their need for a living wage. We know that this led to the founding of the trade union movement. Our Methodist heritage has at its core that sense of liberation for all. That was why Methodists were at the forefront of the temperance movement, seeking to liberate people from addiction and poverty. Why they sought the liberation of women from abuse and oppression. Why they were at the forefront of the abolition movement. The liberation for all is a central tenet of who we are. And Methodists have a strong history of prophetic witness. We have acted in solidarity over the years, boycotting South African goods, beginning the racial justice movement, campaigning to make poverty history. All of these things are part of who we are. So we recognise that we have a strong history of being a justice-seeking church. But where are we now, and how do we go forward? The Walking with Micah project, as I said, spent 2 years of listening to people. And from all of that listening, there came 6 principles. The purpose for justice seeking, the why do we seek justice? And again, I'm just going to share these on my screen. Here we go. Let's do the next one. Where's it gone? There we go. So, these are the 6 principles that have come out of the justice-seeking church. The first, God made human beings in the image of God, each worthy of equal value and dignity. We know from the Bible that we are, as human beings, those who bear the image of God. But it is not just some of us, it is not just those who look like us. All humankind is created to bear the divine image. It is a basic principle and a reason why we act and seek justice. Secondly, God desires the flourishing of creation and human community within it. Creation care has become a big thing currently, quite rightly, because of the crisis that we are in regard to our climate. But this is not just about the care for creation. This is about the interdependence of creation. This is about the interdependence and flourishing of all. The destruction of one part of creation, whether it is a habitat or a species or whatever, will have serious implications for others and in unforeseeable ways. So there is a holistic sense within this. Thirdly, God constantly shows a bias to people experiencing poverty and those who are excluded. We know this from our reading of the Bible. But it raises the challenge that if we are a people who search for justice, then we must always attend to and listen to those who actually live in poverty, those who are marginalised in other ways, must always be made a priority. There is something here about not just doing to, but actually being with, hearing the voices, hearing those stories. The fourth one, God entrusts those with power with a special responsibility for upholding justice. Power is an interesting conversation because all of us have some power. We may not have the power of others. We may not have the political power or the community influence or the power of wealth. But many, even in this room, will have the power of education. We will have a voice. We have consumer power. So the question for us all is, what is our power? And how do we take seriously the responsibility of that power to uphold justice? There is also our responsibility to encourage and challenge those who have more power than us to fulfill their vocation. So I imagine many of us here try to have a relationship with our MP, try to encourage and challenge our MP or our councillors to act in ways that are just. Number 5, God calls all people and nations actively to work for peace and justice. Peace and justice is never just somebody else's responsibility. We all have a part to play. This is not the easy peace. This is not collusion. This is not anything for an easy life. This is, what does it mean to actually seek peace, to actively challenge people for peace? How might we work together with people of faith and no faith to try to resolve conflict, to collaborate, to respect, to actually create places and communities of peace? And number 6, God calls us to live in hope in ways that reflect God's character and the pattern of God's kingdom. There is something here within all this about seeking justice requiring a level of honesty and truth telling. Seeking justice might demand at times that we have to protest or we have to resist. It might require that in honesty we confess our part within something and restitution is needed. It might be that we need to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. But always, through God, there is the hope and the possibility and the opportunity for transformation. So we have 6 principles there. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to talk together maybe about those principles. The final little bit I want to share is the priorities. So if those are the principles, if those are the why we seek justice, if those are the things that are at the heart of our justice seeking, the priorities are 5 very specific areas that after the 2 years of listening through the Walking with Micah project, it was defined that these were the 5 key priorities for the Methodist people. Firstly, tackling inequality and poverty. Secondly, enabling a flourishing environment. 4, seeking justice for refugees. Sorry, that was 3. And 4, opposing discrimination in all forms. And finally, pursuing peace. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is to go in to groups for conversation. The questions are here on the screen. What does justice or injustice look like to you? What are your stories of justice or injustice that you have experienced or seen? When you think about justice, where do you go in the Bible? What are the stories that come to mind around justice seeking from our scriptures? 3, what part of our Methodist tradition do you value in terms of justice seeking? And 4, finally, which of the priorities for justice that we have seen are the principles? Let's do the principles for justice. Speak most to you and why? Okay, welcome back. Part 2. We're just going to spend a little bit of time looking at some verses from Isaiah 61. And so if you have a Bible at home, please look up Isaiah 61. We're going to look at verses 1 to 4 and then 8 to 11. This is the set reading for the third Sunday in Advent. And we're just going to have a little reflect on it now. Now, normally I would ask people to read Bible passages, but as I'm not in the room and I don't know how long it'll take you to read a Bible passage, I'm going to read it myself this once. So from Isaiah 61, reading verses 1 to 4 and then verses 8 to 11. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance for our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendour. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. In my faithfulness, I will reward my people and make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants will be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them will acknowledge that they are a people the Lord has blessed. I delight greatly in the Lord. My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation and arrayed me in a robe of his righteousness. As a bridegroom adorns his head like a priest, and as a bride adorns herself with jewels. For as the soil makes the sprout come up and a garden causes seeds to grow, so the sovereign Lord will make righteousness and praise spring up before all nations. So the passage comes from that post-exilic period of Israel's history. The Babylonian army had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They had ransacked the city. They had taken captive the royal family, the religious leaders, the elite, and many others, and taken them into captivity in Babylon. But now there was a new power. The Persian king Cyrus had defeated the Babylonians and then decreed that the people could return to their homeland. They could go back to Jerusalem. They could rebuild the city and the temple. But of course, this is easier said than done. Many people don't go back. But those who do return, and it is a very different picture from the hope that the prophets have offered. It is humiliating to be in that place of defeat. They fail to rebuild the city. They fail to rebuild the temple to match its former glory. There are economic disparities, religious and political factions, and the reality of life in Jerusalem is nothing like the expectations of a restored Jerusalem, of a righteous community. It is nothing like the prophets proclaimed or was envisaged by the returnees. And so it is into this space, into this despair and failure and sense of being crushed, that Isaiah speaks God's words, not just of hope, but of real transformation. The passage begins with that declaration of divine presence. Be clear. This is what God's action is about. This is what God's presence means. And God does not just go to the powerful. It is very clear that this is the God who goes to the oppressed, who is on the side of the crushed and the captive and the imprisoned, who sits with those who mourn. This is not just a passage about what might be, but a passage of what will be. For this is the God of transformation. And so, good news is delivered to the oppressed. Broken hearts are healed. Liberty is realized for the captives, and the imprisoned, in whatever form they are imprisoned, are released. Isaiah uses the language of Jubilee as he talks about this transformation, as he talks about this restoration. Jubilee, as we know, was that year, the 50th year, when property, when people who had been held as a payment of debt were returned to families that they had originally come from. Isaiah 61 is about proclaiming that Jubilee. This is not, though, just a one-off moment. This is about a new social and economic relationship within the community. This is about something lasting. The year of the Lord's favour. I'm interested that when Jesus used this passage when he went into the temple to offer it as a manifesto for his ministry, he missed out the day. He used that phrase to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. He didn't complete the sentence and talk of the day of vengeance of our God. Maybe again we have a new way, a new kingdom, a new pattern for our relationship and understanding of God. In Isaiah 61, we find those instructions to pay particular attention to those who mourn, to those who despair. This is not a quick fix. This is being attentive to those who are in real pain, to those who are in real suffering. And it is through that attentiveness that they are changed, not because their circumstances are changed, but because the way they see themselves, the way they identify, the way they are regarded by others is changed. And it is from that place of transformation that then they act differently, they live differently, they are transformed. So no longer they have ashes on their head, a sign of humiliation and grief, but instead they wear a festive headdress. Instead, they are honoured guests, anointed with the oil of gladness. Instead, they wear a mantle of praise. They are to be treated as, and they are to become something other than humiliated and fragmented and dispirited and exploitative people. I often come back to the quote of Trevor Huddleston, who it was said of him, actually, it was said of him that he always treated people better than they deserved to be treated. And therefore, he always got the best out of them. This passage is about that transformation, the transformation that God brings, not just in the big, in the release of captives, in the good news for the poor, but it is that attentiveness to those who are hurting, to those who are crushed, to those who despair. As I was reflecting on this, there came to mind my mother-in-law. She passed away in 2021. When I first met my mother-in-law, and Ruth knew Monica when she was alive. When I first met her, she was somebody who was living in a very run-down house. She was living in the depths of depression. She had very little self-worth. But over the course of the years, she became a transformed person. And that happened not just through her involvement in the local church. It happened because she was invited to be part of a church plant. Our own Peter Hancock in this district asked Monica if she would go and make tea at this church that he was planting in the local school. And so she went. She went to make tea because in her mind, that's all she was good for. Now, don't get me wrong. I actually think, blessed are the tea makers. We need far more of them. But in Monica's mind, she was really just a background person. She'd wash up. But what happened through the encouragement, especially of Jane and Peter Hancock and others, was that she was encouraged to write a prayer. She was encouraged to say a prayer. She was encouraged bit by bit to lead worship until in the end, she was a regular worship leader. And she flourished. She flourished because somebody saw her as different to how she saw herself. Because somebody offered her, in the midst of her despair, not just ashes, not just there around how awful life is, but they offered her dignity and value and worth, and it was transformative. I think in Isaiah 61, for all we know the big statements, I think there is something here about that offering of worth, about that change in identity, about that change in attitudes. And when we enable that to happen, when that happens for us, it changes who we are and how we are. The justice-seeking church might involve some really big issues. There are certainly enough of them in the world. To offer good news to the poor, to release captives, to offer hope to the oppressed. But there is also something in here about the small things, the changing the way we perceive people and people perceive themselves. What does that look like? I think it's time for us to go into groups for further conversation. Let me see if I can pull up the questions for us. Hang on just a moment. Okay. Here we go. Let's put that up. So, in Isaiah 61, we know the context in which it was written. It was the context of a broken and demoralized people. I wonder how we would describe our context today. What is the context that we are living in within our society? The same question, in what ways does our justice-seeking church proclaim good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim freedom to the captives, release for prisoners, and comfort for those who mourn? So that's the second conversation. Thirdly, we thought earlier about the two Hebrew words, tzedakah and mishpah, charity and equity, judgment. They express different facets of justice. I wonder how we see different facets of justice worked out today. And final question, in our justice seeking, we long for a better society or world. How do we imagine the year of the Lord's favour? So I invite you to go off. I'm not sure what time you've got left in your meeting, so I'll leave the judgment for how long you have your conversation with Ruth. And I hope that you have a good conversation. And I will sign off now and let Ruth finish off your meeting together. Thank you for being here. I'll see you all next week.